thank you all for inviting me and for the opportunity to participate in this great project. For me, from the beginning, it was quite a challenge because for last years I was dealing with space but from the civilian point of view. So it was a challenge for me to dive into defense and military, because by heart I'm a pacifist, and I still hope that we are all reaching the stars in peaceful purposes. So that's also I will try to take this approach, talking about military and defense in space. Space is very important for everyone, and that's why also my university decided 5 years ago to set up a space for Center for Space Studies, and also serve as an expert at the Polish Space Agency for the purposes of drafting Polish space law. So that's on the table now. And yes, indeed, I put a photo from the times where some negotiations concerning the space treaties, space regulations were conducted. And yes, the space is global. And that's very symptomatic, because even in times where the space treaties or any negotiations concerning space law were happening, it was not during the peaceful time. As Attila mentioned, that was 67. That was from the moment when the Sputnik, the first satellite, was launched. That was the middle of Cold War. That was just after the Cuban crisis. And still, all the states, including Russia, America, China, and all the other countries, were able to sit at the table and negotiate and decide on the peaceful purposes of space. We also have to realize that any war in space will be a global war. No other option, because even if that's just American and Russian satellites, or just two country satellites will have hostile purposes, that will affect all other satellites. That's about space debris that are produced this way. So any war in space will be a global war. That's why we so much should care about treating space as a peaceful place. Outline for my presentation is I would like to show you how does it cope, space law and defense strategies and space law. What is the institutional framework, and what are the roles of United Nations and European Union? That's just two examples, because not even 20 minutes now, it's too short to present all the contexts. And we have also have to take into account the international, regional and national dimension of these all. So, as we heard yesterday in a splendid presentation about dual use, space is also dual use by nature. Space is peaceful, but space, at the same time, is defenseful, as I call it. So space is dual in law, in actors, because we have private actors, commercial actors, governmental actors, and they're all together involved in what's going on in space. If there is a peace, commercial actors are involved in peaceful activities. But if there is a war, there are also commercial, private actors and governments that are together in war. In institutions, there are institutions which are dealing with defense, military, but the same civilian matters in space. I will show you in more details that, and in purposes. So peaceful and military defense purposes, they are there always when we are talking about space. Examples. The best examples are Galileo and Copernicus, which are purely civilian in their purposes, but now they perfectly serve also the military purposes, and that's also one of the reasons why EU is becoming such a leader in outer space matters by civilian programs. So the dual is in outer space, legal, because we have civil space laws, but also we have security and trade restrictions. which concern the dual use of the space equipment. Just to mention the restrictions, the sanctions which were imposed by European Union last 2 years. On the first place, there is a space equipment mentioned. It doesn't matter if it is for commercial or not commercial purpose specifically. It's by nature dual use. As regards institutional, we have United Nations as a primarily body, and we have NATO, and then we have EU, and we have EU members. So what are the correlations between them? What's the impact of those institutions on law and specifically on space law? And now, not good news for lawyers. That's just an excerpt from EU space defense strategy, not just defense strategy, but space defense strategy, which says that law may not be enough. It's not good news for lawyers, yeah. So we are worried that there is a legal gap, but what politicians say that the law may not be enough, that the wars are above law. So. And what's important, it's cooperation and prevention. So when we think about defense strategies versus space law, we have to bear in mind that space defense strategies usually don't deal with the law. They're above law. They are to serve political purposes. And space laws usually don't regulate military issues, which is partially true, but the thing is that even if the space laws, as I show you in a moment, tackle military issues, they don't dive into it. So even if we know what's allowed or not allowed, we don't know precisely how to do it, what is allowed. What Attila mentioned, we don't really know how to deal with some allowed military actions in space. Is it to be licensed? Is it to be subject to some technical standards? What's the correlation with the space debris? So there are many gaps in that. And in fact, maybe the space political cooperation is more effective than space law. So what United Nations are stressing, and EU, that no one can govern a space on its own, that we need international cooperation all the time. But again, cooperation above law, that's the questions which we space lawyers ask ourselves all the time. And let's now look briefly on two institutions that I wanted to turn your attention to. United Nations. As United Nations present itself in terms of space, the United Nations remain the primarily multilateral forum to discuss space security issues. And UNOSA is an office of United Nations which deals specifically with outer space exploration, and UNOSA supporting the global governance of outer space activities. Where is the law here? Forum to discuss, forum to support. It's United Nations looks like withdrawing itself or admitting that it's no longer so powerful to adopt binding laws. So what United Nations achieved so far, that's big, of course. We have United Nations Charter. We have Outer Space Treaty, which is a kind of mother treaty. Attila presented 5 treaties which form the constitution of outer space exploration. And Outer Space Treaty, as first, was 67, and majority of civilized countries ratified it. The last one, Moon Agreement, not even 20. So that shows the tendency in the United Nations power to convince countries to adopt binding provisions which would regulate space. And then we have PAROS, which is a kind of initiative, because the treaty is a draft, so we call it initiative. And then we have plenty of soft laws, like the resolutions of United Nations General Assembly, but they are not binding. It's soft law. So that's a kind of postulate, and that's the something that United Nations is focus on now, because everyone realized that we are not able to change space treaties and we are not able to adopt any new. So we have an explosion of space, of soft laws proposed and adopted as a just resolutions of United Nations General Assembly. Just very briefly, as an example, what are the doubts? Article 4 of Outer Space Treaty is the only article which deals expressly with military issues. So it's about weapon, it's prohibition to place weapon in orbit and in celestial bodies. It's the postulate obligation to act in peaceful purposes. It's what's forbidden, what's not prohibited, but how to do it, what's not prohibited. There is a silence, there is a gap. There is a gap which it's very hard to close. And the other article which seems helpful for interpretation, that space activities are subject to United Nations Charter. That's why I mentioned Charter as one of the really the sources of space law, because we have some self-defense issues in United Nations Charter, so we have to interpret it, what is allowed or not via also the provisions of the United Nations Charter. And then United Nations bodies dealing with militarization of outer space. If we see, that's the Institute of Disarmament. That's open-ended working group. That's PARO's group of governmental experts. None of them have really a power to set binding laws. They are producing reports, etc. So, is it a time of weakening power of United Nations? Just one example. When the initiative, which 50 years ago, during the Cold War time, belonged to United Nations, now is taken over by just some states. And I mean specifically United States, which first proposed Artemis Accord, and Artemis Accord is now signed by more countries than Moon Agreement. So everyone says that's not law, because and not international law, but still, countries are accessing. The same with Assad ban initiative. Same. The United States say we need clear norms, because if not, we face unnecessary risk concerning space. So that's the question. Does it mean that the United Nations are put aside as regards the space law? And now European Union. European Union, first, just a civilian concept of space exploration. We have Lisbon Treaty, which set some ground for common defense policy, not yet space defense. But then, through the civilian programs, EU started to be de facto key player because of mentioned Galileo and Copernicus. And finally, we have a strategy for space defense. What the space defense says: proposing, setting, launching, enhancing various issues, and the first time the strategy defense, space strategy defense, says something about space law. So it looks like European Union attempts to close the gap between the space defense strategies and law. So if it's good or not, that's the fact. As I fully recognize what was said yesterday by Professor Molnar, that EU was not military-like, but had to adjust. Yes, so that's the moment we are adjusting. But what's really the competence of EU as regards space defense and space law? We have a Lisbon Treaty article, one article concerning space law, and it clearly says that the EU has no power to harmonize space law. And then we have space strategy, we have powerful programs, space programs, and we have no competence. So again, the EU is very decisive. EU is proposing space law, but where's the competence? Quite contrary to the United Nations. Has a competence, has no power. So that's something that's very problematic for space lawyers. maybe I will. What are the EU documents? I'm coming to an end slowly. We have regulations concerning space programs. Everything was really done after 2020. European Space Agency was European Space Programs Agency was adopted. Don't mix it with European Space Agency ESA, because it's completely other body. It's not EU body. It's intergovernmental organization. We have a compass, and finally we have last year the EU space strategy. And 2024 is to be the year, is it, of European space law. We are all wondering how it's going to happen, because there is a strong opposition of some countries basing on Lisbon Treaty, but from the other side there is a very strong push from European Union bodies to have this law. Yes, and as regards the institutions, EU institutions links to space defense. Well, are they? All they are. It's the dualism. EUSPA is also involved in that, willingly or not, because it coordinates the Galileo and Copernicus programs. So somehow it is an institution involved in military operations, and that's maybe too complicated and too small. But you see, that's not so easy to trace what's the architecture of the institutional framework for space defense. That's quite fragmented, and that's also kind of a problem. Who has the competence to coordinate the military program? That's something that probably needs a broader discussion. I just would like to tell you that it's fragmented. That maybe if we have European space law, the competences would be much more clear in that respect, and that's why I skip. Just to show you, before I go to the conclusions, that as we trace the countries, the spacefaring countries, all of them at the moment, Russia, United States, China, India, United Kingdom, Japan, have space defense strategies. They started to have space forces. No one has this regulated in the form of space law. That's the blurred border. That's a great problem for the space agencies, which are civilian. Were they competent in regulate, in supervise those activities? Really, that's not. So, and then coming to conclusions, can space sustainability be a connecting paradigm? Space sustainability is something which very directly has much in common with space debris. If there are too much space debris, no one can launch a new satellite, no program can work. So it's not like only a civil problem, it's also a military problem. But it's tackled only in the context of civil space programs and not within military space programs, because those bodies who are competent to regulate, to set the standards, are not much competent as regards military operations in space. So maybe the sustainability will be a connecting postulate, connecting paradigm. And also what's important to note that the EU postulates as regards space law says, yeah, we want to deal with security, safety, and sustainability. And that's mentioned specifically in space defense strategy. So that's a hope that the space sustainability will be connected in EU law, if it happens, also, and will concern equally civilian and military activities. And, well, if we look at the role of EU and United Nations, lawyers are looking, and lawyers and citizens are looking for kind of equilibrium between space and defense and civil aspects. And European Union, with not so with a doubtful competence, is very strong in pushing United Nations role. Maybe it will just, for the moment, for next 20 years, as some says, will be focused on setting the postulates. ideas, but hope for bringing binding legal regulations in military defense issues are very weak. And thank you for your attention, and I hope we have nice discussion. If not now, then during the lunchtime or in the evening. Thank you.